The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Virginia City's dusty Main Street as Marshal Matthew Harris dismounted his horse, his boots raising small clouds in the parched earth. 3 weeks of investigating gold miner deaths had led him to this remote settlement, where the desert winds whispered dark secrets through the sage and creosote. The town had sprung up around the Lewis Mining Company's operations, but something about the place set his instincts on edge. Through the grimy window of the assay office, Matthew observed a heated argument between mine owner John Lewis and a weather-beaten prospector. Lewis cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit, so out of place in this harsh landscape. The prospector jabbed his finger repeatedly at a document, while Lewis maintained an unnaturally calm demeanor that seemed to mask something darker beneath. The saloon across the street bore witness to the town's rough nature. Splintered batwing doors, bullet holes in the facade, and wanted posters curling in the merciless sun. Matthew had seen his share of mining towns, but Virginia City carried an undercurrent of fear that even the most hardened frontiersmen couldn't ignore. 4 dead miners in 3 months, all of them recent Gold Strike recipients. Inside the Cool Spring Saloon, Matthew found the usual afternoon crowd. Card players hunched over felt-topped tables, hard-drinking miners drowning the day's fatigue in whiskey. Behind the bar, Victoria Young wiped glasses with practiced efficiency, her dark eyes taking in everything while revealing nothing. She had that particular wisdom common to saloon keepers in towns, where fortunes were made and lost daily. "Another dead miner?" Victoria asked as Matthew approached the bar, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Found Michael Wright's body yesterday, Marshal. Out in Shadow Canyon. 4th one this quarter, and like the others, he'd just registered a claim." She poured him a coffee without asking, the thick brew steaming in the cool interior. Funny how it's only the lucky ones turning up dead. The marshal studied the room while he sipped his coffee. David King, the company doctor, sat in his usual corner, marking notes in a leather-bound journal. A group of miners huddled near the pot-bellied stove, speaking in hushed tones. Among them was Andrew Young, Victoria's brother and lead foreman at the Lewis mine, his face etched with concern as he glanced frequently toward the saloon entrance. Rebecca Harris, the marshal's sister and town schoolteacher, entered the saloon with purpose, making her way directly to Matthew. Her normally composed features showed strain as she leaned close. "The Wright children are with me now," she whispered. "Their mother Hannah took sick after hearing about Michael. But Matthew, before he died, Michael told Hannah something about a new vein he'd found, something massive." The pieces began falling into place in Matthew's mind. Each murdered miner had registered a significant claim just before their death. The territorial assayers' records showed their finds were substantial, yet the bodies were always found with empty saddlebags. Someone was not only killing these men, but stealing their gold, and possibly their claims through some legal manipulation. Grace Lewis, the mine owner's wife, swept into the saloon like a breath of civilization, her fine dress incongruous against the rough-hewn walls. She moved with deliberate grace toward the marshal, but her eyes darted nervously to her husband's empty chair at his private table. "Marshal Harris," she said softly, "might I have a word in private? There are things about John's business practices that keep me awake at night." The evening crowd began filtering in as shadows lengthened across the floorboards. Matthew noticed Abigail Wright, the local telegraph operator, signaling him discreetly from her corner table. She'd been helping him track claim registrations and title transfers, and her worried expression suggested she'd discovered something significant. The marshal felt the weight of multiple gazes upon him, some hopeful, others wary, a few openly hostile. As night settled over Virginia City, Matthew pieced together the emerging pattern. The murders weren't random acts of claim jumping, they were calculated executions designed to keep something hidden. The Territorial Mining Office had recorded an unusual number of claim transfers to Lewis Mining Company following each death, all processed with suspicious speed. But why kill successful miners unless their discoveries threatened something larger? Matthew slipped through the crowded saloon toward Abigail's table, careful to maintain a casual demeanor despite his racing thoughts. The telegraph operator's fingers drummed nervously on a stack of papers as he approached. Around them, the usual evening din provided cover for their conversation, miners' boisterous laughter mixing with the tinny notes of a poorly tuned piano. "I've been cross-referencing the dates," Abigail whispered, spreading out several telegraph transcripts. "Every time a miner struck it rich, They'd receive a visit from John's business representative within days. Those who refused to sell their claims to Lewis Mining were found dead within a week. Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed to specific messages, dates, and names that formed an undeniable pattern of corruption. The dry desert wind rattled the saloon's windows as Matthew studied the documents. He recognized several victims' names, all experienced prospectors who'd worked their claims for years before suddenly hitting substantial deposits. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Each murder had been staged to look like an accident or robbery, but the marshal now saw the calculated precision behind them. Outside, a dust devil whirled past the window, momentarily darkening the room. Matthew noticed David Lewis, John's younger brother and head of security for the mining company, watching their table from the bar. The man's hand rested casually near his holster, his eyes cold and evaluating. Matthew shifted position to better shield Abigail's documents from view. "There's more," Abigail continued, her voice barely audible. "I've been monitoring messages between John and his contacts in Santa Fe. They're preparing for a massive shipment, far larger than anything the registered claims could produce. They're hiding a major discovery, Matthew. Something big enough to reshape the whole territory's economy if word got out." The marshal's mind raced through implications. If Lewis Mining had found a massive gold vein, keeping it secret would let them buy up surrounding claims for pennies on the dollar. Anyone who stumbled upon evidence of the motherlode would threaten their scheme. The murders weren't just about greed. They were about control. A commotion near the entrance drew Matthew's attention. Hannah, the local assayer's widow, stumbled in looking distraught. Her husband Michael had died 2 months prior in what was ruled a mining accident. Matthew now wondered if Michael had discovered something in those ore samples that sealed his fate. Hannah's eyes met his briefly before she hurried toward the back room. "The shipping manifests don't match the production reports," Abigail explained, sliding another document forward. "Lewis Mining is moving 3 times more gold than their registered claims should yield. The extra has to be coming from somewhere unrecorded. I think that's what Michael discovered before his accident." Matthew carefully gathered the papers, his expression neutral despite the gravity of the evidence. He'd need more proof before moving against someone as powerful as John Lewis. But the pieces were falling into place. The killer wasn't just protecting a secret mine. He was orchestrating a massive land grab that would give him control of the entire region's gold production. As he stood to leave, Matthew caught sight of Victoria, John Lewis's wife, watching him from the upper balcony. Her face bore an expression of quiet desperation that made him wonder how much she knew about her husband's dealings. She quickly turned away when their eyes met, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor like a ghost. The night air carried the scent of sage as Matthew stepped onto the boardwalk. He needed to move carefully now. Too many people had already died protecting this secret. Somewhere in the maze of Lewis Mining's holdings lay evidence of the hidden motherlode, and he'd have to find it before anyone else connected the dots and became the next victim. The crunch of Matthew's boots on weathered planks echoed through the empty street as he made his way toward the sheriff's office. A warm breeze stirred loose papers against storefronts, each bearing the same stark message: "Claim jumper found dead," followed by dates spanning the past 6 months. He'd counted 7 victims so far, each discovered in seemingly random locations throughout Lewis Mining's vast territory. But the marshal knew better. These weren't random at all. Inside the cramped office, Deputy David hunched over a spread of maps, his weathered face illuminated by lamplight. He'd been marking the locations of each body, creating a pattern that grew more deliberate with each victim. The deputy looked up as Matthew entered, his expression grim. "Found something you ought to see, Marshal." "That last victim, Michael Carter. He had these hidden in his boot." David slid several folded papers across the desk. Matthew examined the documents, crude sketches of tunnel systems that didn't appear on any official Lewis Mining maps. The rough drawings showed a network of passages leading to what appeared to be a massive chamber, marked only with a hastily scrawled X. More telling were the dates in the corner. They preceded every murder by exactly 3 days. The sound of horses outside drew their attention. Through the window, Matthew watched as John Lewis's foreman, Andrew, led a group of miners toward the outskirts of town. The timing was suspicious. Midnight was an unusual hour to begin a shift. He noted how they carried no mining equipment, only rifles slung across their backs. Victoria's earlier expression of fear suddenly made more sense. She wasn't just a worried wife. She was a witness trapped in her own home. Marshal Matthew Harris wiped the sweat from his brow as he studied the crude map sketched on yellowed parchment. 3 red X's marked the locations where gold miners had been found dead in the past month, all within a mile of the King Mine outside Virginia City. The victims shared one crucial detail. Each had recently struck it rich. The marshal's temporary office in the assayer's building offered little refuge from the merciless Nevada desert heat that seemed to amplify the stench of death lingering in his nostrils from the latest crime scene. Andrew Young, the 4th victim, had been discovered that morning face down in Blood Creek, his skull crushed by what appeared to be a mining pick. Like the others before him, Young's gold claim papers were missing, though everyone in town knew he'd hit a wealthy vein just days prior. The marshal's fingers traced the creek's winding path on the map, noting how it connected all the murder sites like a serpentine thread of fate. Rebecca Lewis, the assayer's daughter, watched Marshal Harris with worried eyes as she organized claim documents at her father's desk. "Marshal, there's something you should know about Michael King," she said hesitantly. "He's been acting strange lately, holding secret meetings with some rough men I've never seen before. And he's been pressuring Father to adjust some of the official gold yield records." The marshal's interest peaked at the mention of the mine owner. Michael King had arrived in Virginia City 3 years ago, buying up claims and consolidating them into what became the territory's largest mining operation. While King presented himself as a sophisticated businessman, Harris had noticed an underlying current of menace beneath the man's polished veneer. The recent murders had begun shortly after King announced plans to expand his operations. A commotion outside drew their attention as David Wright, a grizzled prospector, burst through the door. "Marshal, you need to see this," he exclaimed, clutching a worn leather pouch. "I was working my claim up near Rattler's Ridge when I found these papers hidden under a rock." Inside the pouch were blood-stained claim documents belonging to the previous victims, along with a crude map marking what appeared to be an enormous undiscovered gold deposit. The implications hit Marshal Harris like a physical blow. If word got out about a gold vein of that size, it would trigger a massive rush that could destabilize the entire territory's economy. More prospectors would mean more competition for existing claims, threatening King's monopoly. The marshal studied the documents with growing certainty that he'd stumbled onto the killer's motive, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Victoria Wright, David's wife and owner of the town's only restaurant, provided an unexpected lead that afternoon. That new foreman King hired, John Lewis, no relation to the assayer. He came in last night drinking heavily and muttering about keeping secrets buried, and how some folks need to learn when to keep quiet. He had fresh scratches on his hands and blood on his boots. The marshal's investigation took an ominous turn when he discovered that John Lewis had previously worked for King at other mining operations where accidents had claimed the lives of workers who'd struck rich veins. The pattern was becoming clear, but Harris knew he needed more than circumstantial evidence to prove King was orchestrating the murders through his foreman. Hannah King, Michael's wife, provided another piece of the puzzle when she secretly approached the marshal that evening. With trembling hands, she passed him her husband's ledger, its pages filled with coded entries tracking the murdered miner's discoveries. "He thinks I don't know what he's done," she whispered, "but I've seen him meeting with John late at night, passing money and mapping out where the rich claims are." Grace Young, the widow of the latest victim, proved to be a crucial ally. She revealed that her husband had confided in her about discovering a massive untapped gold deposit, one that connected all the recent strike locations. Andrew had been planning to register the claim the very day he was killed. More importantly, she had saved a sample of the unique gold-bearing quartz from the site, which could prove the connection between the murders. As Marshal Harris pieced together the evidence, he realized he was dealing with something far more sinister than random claim jumping. King had created an elaborate conspiracy to maintain control over Virginia City's gold production, using murder to suppress any discoveries that threatened his interests. But proving it would require catching the killer in the act, and the marshal had a plan to do just that. The following day, Harris arranged for word to spread about a major gold strike at an abandoned claim near Blood Creek. He knew King's greed would force him to act, especially since the location matched the secret map's markings. The marshal stationed deputies at strategic points while he waited in the worn-out mine shaft, knowing it was only a matter of time before the killer came to silence another supposed threat to King's empire. As dusk approached, the marshal heard footsteps crunching on gravel outside the mine entrance. He tightened his grip on his revolver, preparing himself for what promised to be a deadly confrontation. The killer was coming, but Harris couldn't have predicted the shocking truth about who was really behind the murders, or the devastating secret that would shake Virginia City to its very foundations. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the mine shaft's damp walls. Marshal Harris steadied his breathing, pressed against the rough-hewn timbers that barely held back the mountain's weight. Through the dim light filtering from his covered lantern, he caught glimpses of a shadow stretching across the entrance. But instead of one figure, there were two, and the voices that carried down the tunnel belonged to both a man and a woman. "Are you certain this is where Matthew reported the strike?" The female voice was refined, cultured, definitely not a typical miner's wife. Harris recognized it immediately as belonging to Victoria King, the mine owner's supposedly invalid sister, who rarely left their mansion on the hill above Virginia City. "The coordinates match perfectly, Victoria. If there's truth to that old prospector's ravings, the mother lode extends all the way through this claim." The male voice belonged to Andrew King himself, and Harris's blood ran cold at the casual way they discussed potential murder. "We can't risk another find becoming public. The territorial governor is already asking too many questions about our operation." A match flared in the darkness as King lit a lantern of his own. Harris watched through a gap in the support beams as Victoria produced a small glass vial from her sleeve. "The same as the others?" she asked, and her brother nodded grimly. "Quick and quiet. They'll blame it on bad air in the mine, just like before." The revelation hit Harris like a physical blow. It hadn't been King working alone. His supposedly frail sister was equally complicit in the murders. The siblings had been systematically eliminating anyone who stumbled upon their secret, using poison to make the deaths appear accidental, while they maintained their respectable facade. The marshal knew he couldn't wait any longer. His deputies were too far away to hear a struggle, and the Kings were moving deeper into the mine where they expected to find their next victim. With practiced silence, Harris eased around the support beam, his revolver trained on the conspirators' backs. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. Victoria spun first, the vial dropping from her fingers to shatter on the rocky floor. The acrid smell of chemicals filled the confined space as Andrew King's hand darted toward his coat. "I wouldn't," Harris warned, thumbing back the hammer of his Colt. "Your sister's already dropped enough evidence to hang you both." "You don't understand what's at stake, Marshal," Victoria hissed, her refined manner cracking to reveal something far more dangerous beneath. "This isn't about simple greed. The gold we've found, it's beyond anything ever discovered in the territory. If word gets out, it would destroy everything we've built. The economy would collapse overnight." Andrew King's laugh was bitter as he slowly raised his hands. "Did you think we enjoyed silencing those poor souls? Every death weighed on us. But better a few strategic losses than watching Virginia City tear itself apart in a gold rush that would make 49 look like a church picnic." Harris kept his weapon trained on them both, noting how they instinctively moved to protect each other despite their predicament. "Murder is murder," he stated firmly, "no matter how you try to justify it. And I've got enough evidence now to make sure justice is served." But before he could motion them toward the mine entrance, a rumble shook the tunnel. Years of neglect had left the supports weakened, and the vibration of their voices was the final straw. Harris barely had time to shout a warning before the first timbers gave way with a thunderous crack. The Kings bolted toward the entrance as the ceiling began to collapse, forcing the marshal to dive for cover as tons of rock and earth came crashing down. In the chaos and darkness that followed, Harris found himself trapped behind a wall of debris, the King's desperate scrambling audible on the other side. He had survived, but now he was sealed in the very mine that held the secret worth killing for, with only his covered lantern and dwindling air to sustain him while his deputies frantically worked to dig him out. And somewhere in the pitch-black tunnel behind him lay the mother lode that had driven the Kings to murder, a fortune in gold that might now become his tomb, unless he could find another way out through the mountain's ancient passages. The real test of survival was just beginning, and Harris knew the Kings wouldn't simply flee while he remained a threat to their deadly secret. Marshal Matthew Harris crouched behind a stack of empty ore carts as gunfire peppered the wooden beams above his head. The dim light of the mine shaft cast long shadows across the rough-hewn walls, the air thick with gun smoke and coal dust. 3 days of investigation had led to this moment, trapped 200 feet below the surface of the Virginia City silver mine, facing off against mine owner John Wright and his hired guns. The past week's revelations crashed through Matthew's mind as he checked his remaining ammunition. The peculiar pattern of murders had finally made sense when he discovered Wright's secret ledger hidden in the assay office, detailed records of which miners had stumbled upon the massive gold vein that Wright had concealed behind false silver deposits. Each victim had been meticulously tracked before meeting their accident in the depths of the mine. Rebecca Young's words echoed in his thoughts. The widow of the first victim, David Young, who had confided in her about striking gold just days before his death. He was so excited, Marshall. Said it was the biggest vein he'd ever seen. Then they found him crushed under a cave-in that the foreman swore wasn't possible in that section. Her tears had been the first crack in Wright's carefully constructed facade. A bullet splintered the cart beside Matthew's head, sending wooden shards flying. He heard Wright's voice boom through the tunnel. "You're a fool, Harris. Do you have any idea what that gold would do to this territory? The chaos it would cause? I'm protecting these people from themselves." The raw desperation in Wright's voice revealed the truth. This was about more than mere greed. Michael Lewis, the territorial bank manager, had explained it to Matthew just hours earlier. A gold strike that size would destabilize the entire region's economy. Every prospector from here to Santa Fe would abandon their claims. Towns would empty overnight. The banking system could collapse. Wright's murders suddenly took on a twisted logic, sacrificing the few to protect the many, or so he believed. Victoria King's death had been the final piece of the puzzle. The mine's bookkeeper had been getting close to the truth, tracking discrepancies in the ore shipments. Wright had arranged her accidental fall down the mine shaft just yesterday. But she'd managed to pass a coded message to her sister Grace, who brought it straight to Matthew. The evidence was damning, and Wright knew it. "Last chance, Marshall," Wright's voice echoed again. "Walk away now, and we can both pretend this never happened. The territory needs this secret kept." Matthew could hear the man's footsteps approaching, boots crunching on loose rock. The mine owner was growing desperate, his carefully maintained control crumbling like the very walls around them. Matthew thought of Andrew Harris, his younger brother working the claims near Laredo, and all the other honest miners who deserved to know the truth. Wright's protection was nothing but a convenient excuse for murder. The marshal checked his Colt one final time, listening to the approaching footsteps. The moment of truth had arrived. With explosive suddenness, Matthew rolled from behind the cart, firing twice in rapid succession. His first shot caught Wright's lantern, plunging the tunnel into darkness. The second found its mark in Wright's shoulder, sending the mine owner sprawling. Two more shots dropped Wright's hired guns as they fired blindly in the blackness. The sound of falling weapons echoed through the shaft. "It's over, Wright," Matthew called out, striking a match to relight a fallen lantern. The flickering flame revealed Wright clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of defeat and fury. "The territorial governor is already on his way with regulators. That gold vein will be properly registered and developed, with fair shares for all claim holders. Your days of playing God with people's lives are finished." Wright's laugh was hollow, tinged with pain and bitterness. "You have no idea what you've done, Marshall. When the news breaks, every desperate soul within 500 miles will descend on Virginia City like locusts. The blood will be on your hands." Matthew secured Wright's wrists with iron cuffs, ignoring the man's dark prophecy. Justice had to matter more than convenience. Hannah Wright appeared at the mine entrance as Matthew emerged with his prisoners, her face pale in the late afternoon sun. The mine owner's wife had been the one to confirm Matthew's suspicions, unable to live with her husband's crimes any longer. Her quiet strength had helped bring down Wright's empire of secrets and lies. Now she stood witness to its final collapse. Abigail Lewis, the territory's circuit judge, arrived the next morning to begin proceedings. Wright's trial would be swift, his guilt beyond question. But Matthew knew the real challenges lay ahead: managing the gold discovery's impact, preventing chaos, ensuring fair distribution of claims. Yet, as he watched the sunrise paint the desert in shades of promise, he felt a deep certainty that justice had been served. The courthouse in Virginia City buzzed with tension as Wright's trial began. Despite the building's thick adobe walls, the desert heat seeped through, making the packed room feel like an oven. Matthew stood near the witness stand, watching as Judge Lewis maintained order among the restless crowd of miners and townspeople who had come to see justice served. The evidence against Wright was damning. Detailed ledgers of his murders, carefully annotated maps of the hidden gold deposits, and most crucially, Hannah's testimony. The proceedings took an unexpected turn when David Thompson, Wright's former foreman, burst through the doors. Blood stained his shirt, and he clutched a leather satchel. "There's been trouble at the mine," he gasped. "Men from Santa Fe. They're trying to jump claims already." Matthew exchanged glances with Judge Lewis, who nodded grimly. The chaos Wright had predicted was beginning sooner than expected. Matthew deputized a small group of trusted miners, including Michael Reeves and Andrew Parker, to help maintain order. They rode out to the mine while the trial continued, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing through the narrow streets. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder. Someone had already started shooting. At the mine entrance, they found a standoff between local miners and a rough group from Santa Fe. Matthew recognized their leader, John Hawkins, a notorious claim jumper who'd caused trouble from Laredo to Amarillo. The situation teetered on the edge of violence, with both sides fingering their weapons nervously. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rocky ground, turning the scene into a tableau of impending conflict. Hannah Wright appeared again, this time carrying documents from her husband's safe. "These are the legal claim boundaries," she announced, her voice steady despite the tension. "My husband's crimes don't negate the rightful claims of those who worked this land honestly." The papers provided a framework for fair distribution, though Matthew knew implementing it would require delicate handling. Back in the courthouse, Wright's trial reached its conclusion as the sun set behind the mountains. Judge Lewis's verdict was unequivocal: death by hanging. But before sentence could be carried out, Wright made one final play. He offered to reveal the location of additional gold deposits in exchange for mercy. The courtroom erupted in chaos as miners argued over the proposal, their shouts echoing off the walls. Matthew stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. "The law isn't negotiable," he declared, "and neither is justice." He could see the approval in Judge Lewis's eyes as she maintained her original sentence. Hannah Wright stood quietly in the corner, tears streaming down her face. Not for her husband, but for the weight finally lifting from her conscience. The following dawn brought new challenges. Word of the gold had spread faster than anyone anticipated. Wagons and riders were already visible on the horizon, kicking up dust clouds that turned the sunrise blood red. Matthew organized his deputies into patrols, establishing claim registration procedures and setting up a temporary office in the old assayers building. Victoria Martinez, the town's banker, worked with Hannah to create a system for managing the incoming wealth. They converted the bank's basement into a secure storage facility, hiring additional guards and implementing strict protocols. The goal was to prevent the economic instability Wright had feared while ensuring fair distribution of the territory's newfound riches. As Wright awaited his fate in the jail, Matthew discovered one final twist. Hidden in the mine owner's personal Bible was a map showing a network of caves extending far beyond the known claims. These caverns contained not just gold, but silver and copper deposits that could sustain the region's economy for decades. The discovery transformed Wright's desperate attempt to control the wealth into something larger, a chance for Virginia City to grow sustainably rather than burn out like so many other boomtowns. Judge Lewis worked with Matthew to draft new mining regulations, incorporating lessons learned from other territories' mistakes. The document they created would later serve as a model for mining law throughout the Western territories. Hannah's knowledge of her husband's operations proved invaluable in understanding how to prevent similar crimes in the future. The day of Wright's execution dawned clear and cold. The entire town gathered to witness justice being served, but there was no celebration in their hearts. Matthew watched as the man who had killed to keep his secrets walked steadily to the gallows. His prophecy of chaos transformed into an opportunity for progress through the very justice he had fought to prevent. Marshal Matthew Harris stood at the entrance to the Virginia City mine, his weathered face set with grim determination as he watched Andrew Wright, the mine owner, being led away in irons. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert valley, painting the scene in stark contrasts of light and shadow that seemed fitting for the dark revelations of the past few days. Behind him, a crowd of miners and townsfolk gathered, their whispered conversations carrying on the dry wind. Rebecca Young, The assayer's widow stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. Her husband, John, had been the first victim, found dead in his office with gold dust scattered across his desk. Now she knew the truth. He had discovered Wright's secret and paid the ultimate price. Matthew placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the justice he'd finally delivered. The investigation had taken him deep into the twisted web of Virginia City's power structure. Wright had murdered 7 men, all of whom had stumbled upon evidence of the massive gold deposit he'd been concealing. The killer had used the chaos of claim disputes and mining accidents as cover, but his carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled under the marshal's relentless pursuit. David Lewis, the young deputy who'd helped crack the case, emerged from the mine shaft carrying leather-bound ledgers that detailed Wright's elaborate scheme. The mine owner had been systematically buying up surrounding claims while keeping news of the mother lode secret, planning to control the entire region's gold supply. Those who discovered too much met with tragic accidents. Grace Harris, Matthew's wife and the town's schoolteacher, made her way through the crowd to stand beside him. She'd been instrumental in piecing together the pattern, noticing how each victim had visited the assayer's office shortly before their deaths. Her quiet wisdom had helped guide Matthew through the darkest moments of the investigation, when it seemed the killer would never be caught. The sound of hammering echoed across the street as workers began dismantling the false wall Wright had built in the mine's main tunnel. Behind it lay the massive gold vein he'd killed to protect, enough wealth to have destabilized the entire territory's economy if word had gotten out. The territorial governor would be arriving soon to determine how to manage the discovery. Michael King, the surviving mine foreman, approached Marshal Harris with a troubled expression. "What happens now?" "Half the men are talking about leaving, saying the mine's cursed." Matthew understood their fear. The murders had shaken everyone's faith in the systems meant to protect them. But he also saw an opportunity for the community to rebuild something better from the ashes of Wright's crimes. Victoria Wright, Andrew's wife, sat alone on a bench outside the jail, her proud bearing finally broken. She'd known nothing of her husband's crimes, but now faced an uncertain future as everything they'd built together crumbled. Matthew felt a mixture of pity and anger. Her ignorance had been cultivated by Andrew's careful manipulations, yet innocent men had died while she enjoyed the fruits of those murders. Hannah Lewis, who'd lost her brother to Wright's schemes, organized the other mining widows to ensure they received fair compensation from the seized assets. The women's determination to forge ahead inspired Matthew. They refused to let tragedy define them, instead working to create positive change in the wake of darkness. Their strength embodied the true spirit of the frontier. As the sun climbed higher, Marshal Harris began the long process of documenting everything for the territorial court. Each detail would need to be preserved, each piece of evidence cataloged. But his thoughts kept returning to the victims. Good men whose only crime had been discovering the truth. Their graves on Boot Hill would serve as a permanent reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, would eventually prevail. The Territorial Bank sent representatives to begin assessing the true scope of the gold deposit. Initial estimates suggested it was even larger than Wright had realized, enough wealth to fund schools, roads, and other improvements across the entire region. Matthew hoped the treasure that had inspired such evil might now be used to build something positive for future generations. In the following days, Virginia City began to heal. New safety protocols were established for the mines, with greater oversight and protections for workers. The widows received their settlements, and many chose to remain, helping to shape the growing community. Matthew watched with satisfaction as justice and progress gradually replaced fear and suspicion. Rebecca Young chose to reopen her husband's assay office, determined to honor his memory by serving the mining community with the same integrity he'd shown. Matthew made sure she had protection until the last of Wright's possible conspirators were cleared. Her courage in facing down her fears earned her the respect of everyone in town. The trial was held in Santa Fe, drawing spectators from across the territory. Wright maintained his innocence until the end, but the evidence Matthew had gathered proved insurmountable. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning their verdict. Justice had been served, but the marshal knew the true healing was just beginning. As summer faded into autumn, Virginia City found its new rhythm. The mine operated under joint ownership of the workers, with strict oversight from the territorial government. The ghost of Andrew Wright's crimes gradually faded, replaced by the hope of a community determined to build something better from the ashes of tragedy. Matthew Harris remained as Marshal, but his role evolved from hunter of killers to shepherd of progress. The lessons learned from Wright's crimes led to reforms throughout the territory. Sometimes at night, standing on his porch with Grace beside him, he would look out over the town and feel pride in how far they'd come from those dark days of fear and suspicion. The story of the Virginia City murders became legend, but not in the way of typical frontier tales. Instead of celebrating violence, it served as a reminder that justice and community could triumph over greed and deception. The gold that had inspired such evil ultimately helped build schools, churches, and a future worthy of those who had died protecting the truth. Years passed, and Virginia City flourished under its new cooperative system. Matthew Harris watched as the once fearful mining camp transformed into a proper town, with sturdy wooden sidewalks replacing the muddy paths where he'd once tracked a killer's footprints. The territorial governor had appointed him superintendent of mining safety, a position that allowed him to ensure no future Andrew Wright could exploit desperate workers. Grace opened a school for the miners' children, teaching them reading and arithmetic in a bright classroom built with the very gold that had once driven men to murder. She often told Matthew how the sound of children's laughter had finally drowned out the echoes of tragedy that had long haunted the canyon walls. Their own daughter, named Hannah after one of Wright's victims, grew up hearing carefully edited versions of the tale that had brought her parents together. The mine's success attracted more families to Virginia City, and soon the population swelled beyond anyone's expectations. Matthew worked with the territorial legislature to establish regulations that became a model for other mining communities. The joint ownership system proved so successful that similar arrangements spread to operations in Amarillo and Laredo, though none matched Virginia City's prosperity. One crisp autumn morning, as Matthew supervised the installation of new safety equipment, an old-timer named David Patterson approached him with trembling hands clutching a weathered journal. It had belonged to Andrew Wright, discovered hidden in a forgotten storage room of the old office. The pages revealed the full extent of Wright's madness, detailed plans for murders he hadn't yet committed when justice finally caught him. The discovery stirred uncomfortable memories, but it also provided closure for many families who had never fully understood why their loved ones were targeted. Matthew arranged a special memorial service where he burned the journal publicly, letting the ashes scatter across the desert wind. The ceremony helped the community finally release the last ghostly tendrils of Wright's influence. Victoria, who had survived Wright's attempt on her life and testified against him, became a respected voice in town affairs. She established a widow's fund using her share of the mine's profits, ensuring that no family would face the desperate circumstances that had once driven so many to accept Wright's exploitation. Her scarred face became a symbol of survival and resilience. The territorial governor visited Virginia City on its 10th anniversary as a cooperative venture. Standing on the steps of the new courthouse, he praised the town as proof that justice and prosperity could coexist on the frontier. Matthew stood in the crowd that day, holding Grace's hand, remembering the night they'd cornered Wright in that dark mine shaft, knowing the price of truth had been paid in full. As Virginia City grew, it attracted the attention of Eastern newspapers. Reporters arrived expecting to find a rough mining camp and instead discovered a community that had transformed tragedy into triumph. Their stories spoke not of gunfights and outlaws, but of how a determined marshal and brave townspeople had built something remarkable from the ashes of corruption. The mine's wealth continued to flow, but now it enriched the entire territory. Matthew ensured that every new vein discovered was properly registered and fairly distributed according to the cooperative's charter. The system wasn't perfect, but it prevented any single person from accumulating the kind of power that had corrupted Andrew Wright. On quiet evenings, Matthew would sometimes ride out to the spot where he'd first found Wright's victims. The desert had long since reclaimed any trace of those dark events, but the memory served as a reminder of why vigilance mattered. The wind would whisper through the canyon, carrying not the cries of the dead, but the sounds of a thriving town that had learned to value justice above gold. The story of Virginia City became required teaching in territorial schools, not as a tale of violence, but as a lesson in how communities could overcome their darkest chapters. Grace made sure her students understood that the real wealth wasn't in the gold they pulled from the earth, but in the bonds of trust they built with each other. And so, The legacy of the Virginia City murders transformed from a story of greed and betrayal into one of redemption and renewal. The gold that had once driven men to kill now funded libraries, hospitals, and dreams of a better future. Matthew Harris lived to see his grandchildren play in streets that had once run with blood, knowing that sometimes justice plants seeds that bloom long after the gun smoke clears.